We're now covering how to prevent and retain your guard from an under the legs pass. So if I just borrow Ari for a quick moment, we'll go through the different types of under the legs passes in a moment, but as a general thing, what we're covering is when someone starts to work under the legs to start to get around the guard in this particular scenario. Okay. Now, the way we're going to approach this, as there are different types of under the legs passes, some things that there's some very common goals the person who's going under the legs is going to look to achieve along the way to passing the guard. So that's what we're going to focus on, and there's some goals that we, as the person trying to retain our guard, are looking to achieve as well in order to prevent and recover from that. So we're going to mostly approach this from a conceptual point of view in understanding how to limit your opponent from achieving their goals and how to achieve your goals from each of the different scenarios, and that will kind of transcend across the different types of passes that they do. So whether they're using, what we'll cover in a moment, is some of the different types, such as a single under, double under, or over under. These types of these concepts should apply to each of them. So that's how we're going to approach it. But then after that, so after we go through the conceptual model, we're then going to go through from a stages model too. Okay, so then we're going to look at early, like prevention, then what we would do from the mid stage, and then what we would do at the late stage. And then we'll go through the specific passes and whether there's anything different that we would do in those specific individual passes. So we're going to kind of attack it from three different angles, but the main one we want is this conceptual model where we're understanding what our opponent is trying to do and understanding exactly what we're trying to do for each of their goals they're trying to achieve. Now, under the legs passing is something you can become extremely comfortable with. Despite it obviously being you generally don't want someone passing under your legs, there are some people who will pull guard, deliberately allowing their opponent to go under the legs because it gives you the sleeve grips, gives you control of their arms, and they're so confident in retaining their guard from there that once they have the sleeve grips, they know they're going to get their guard back and have control of their opponent. So you can develop this to a very high level where you actually want that to be the avenue that your opponent tries to pass you with.
So in this next section, we're going to be briefly covering the 4 different types of under the legs passes. So looking at the double under pass, single under pass, the over under pass, and then the stack using the C grips on the ankles. Now we're just going to look at the different types of under the legs passes that you'll come across. So the very first one is the double unders pass, where I've got 2 underhooks on my opponent's hips, and I'm looking to initiate my under the legs pass. It's quite hard to just pass straight away from the double unders. You're usually using the double unders to set up a stack pass or a single under pass. So I can use the double unders in a tripod to lift my opponent up. You'll see some people using the double unders from the knees, using like a switch out to throw the hips to one side to force your opponent to lift their hips up to recover. Then there's the single under. So the single under, I'm just using one underhook and I'm trying to offset my opponent's hips to one side, usually looking for a cross collar grip. And then from here, I'm looking to finish the pass like so. The next is the over under. The over under can be chained quite well with the single under. And basically I've got one underhook and one overhook, like so. And I'm looking to redirect my opponent's hips and then finish. Then there's the stack with the C grips. So I'm trying to take my opponent's heels away from his butt and then bring his toes, to the floor to put him in a stack and then work for either the pass or the back take from here.
Now there is a scenario where our opponent is going under the legs and then they might bring their knee over the top into like a near side knee through here. So it's kind of a mix of an under the legs pass and a through the legs pass here. So you can see still under one leg and through. Now this particular scenario we have covered in the through the legs passing section as a so if you want to study that or that's an issue you're having, it's for when, so if you go through the legs, get that out now. Yeah. So you look for the section where we're here and the person's reached under the leg, and we covered a whole bunch of options to deal with that in the through the leg section. There's a few different ways we're going to look to recover from an under the legs pass. I'm going to go very broad first at what I'd say the 2 main ways are, and then one way we can go for if we're particularly late. But the two main ways are that Ari's under the legs is to pummel your feet back in front. So we're here and I find a way to get my feet back in front to some degree, and that lets me recover. And there's different ways and methods we're going to cover throughout this series. We'll go through that. The other very common method is instead of your feet being the lead thing here, it's going to be your knee dropping. So finding a way to drop your knee down first. Okay, so you can see my knees drop below the arms. And it could be that your knees drop, so you might push their arm above the line of your knee as well. But once you've achieved that, it usually will allow you to pummel your feet second, but it's a kind of a different approach to recovering. Okay, and these will come up, early and late stage, and there's different ways of doing this. It can be some like this, where I end up freeing my knee like so to recover. The last way to recover, which is the one we don't really want to do, is to essentially almost turn your back. Okay, so that's where, like, when it gets really late and I just know my feet have no chance of getting back, there is sometimes the chance to turn and then try to escape like that. But again, that's not our preferred method. We want to go for those first two if we can. We're now talking about whether defending the stack pass is bad for your body. And first thing I want to say is it does suck. Like, I don't think anyone, actually apart from Ari, most people, when someone goes for an under the legs pass, it's usually like, oh, this is going to be a tiring and sometimes a painful experience. It's usually the one, if someone says they're a pressure passer, one of the things you're expecting is that they like to go under the legs and kind of put a lot of pressure on their opponent, because you can really wear someone down on top. So is it bad for your body? Well, I think the more flexible you are, the less bad it is for your body. So I think you probably should work to get a baseline level of flexibility if you're wanting to spend a lot of time training this position, because otherwise you will start to put strain on your neck. I'll get Ari to jump on top. But yeah, what's going to happen is, as Ari starts to push me forward, you can see my back's getting bent, okay, and it is leaning and putting a lot of pressure, and I'm fighting that. Or even if I'm just stuck here for a long time with my spine curled like that, this starts to put a lot of pressure on your spine. And even worse, if you don't have, see, I've got flexibility in my spine here, where my spine my lower back can kind of bend. If your lower back doesn't bend, it actually goes onto your upper back or your neck. So if we do the same thing, but I'm very stiff, I get stacked like this, okay? And this is actually terrible for your neck. You really don't. You should not play this style at all. You should bail and kind of let them pass immediately if you feel like that's what's happening to you, where you're getting pressure on your neck, okay? But the best thing you can do is have flexibility through your hamstrings, okay? And hips and adductors. If I have flexible enough hamstrings, see how as he stacks, my hips and my back don't have to lift too high until I can touch the mat with my feet. Okay. When my feet can touch the mat, I no longer get stacked further, so my back doesn't lift as high. And the more flexible you are with your hamstrings, the better. I'm just going to give an example. Hamstring is, when I say hamstring, it's your ability to pull your knee to your chest and also your foot backwards. Okay. So if I can only bend my knee to here and my foot can't go any further back than there, then if Ari stacks, look how much my hips have to lift to actually touch the ground. The more I can extend here, the more my hips drop. Okay. I'm going to show you on Ari because he's extremely flexible, and you'll see the benefit. This makes it actually better and easier to defend as well. But Ari can have his hips very low while his feet touch the ground, and that's something you can achieve through a lot of stretching. Now, it is really important to understand that, especially when your spine is bent, the worst thing you can do is try to fight to straighten it again, but by pushing, because when you do that, there's actually a lot of compressive load on your back with your muscles and everything trying to work, and it actually, the amount of force going through your spine goes up quite a lot. So if Ari stacks me here, there's already, like, being bent sucks, but being bent and he's leaning in and I'm trying to push my legs back, that's how you get a really bad injury in your back. It's much better to relax, potentially let him get past, or relax and try to use like your different angles and movements with your body to try to recover, as opposed to big pushes and extensions back, because that's going to be very bad. So if you're not flexible, then what we recommend is don't spend And even just generally when you start practicing this, because it does put pressure on your spine, like do it gradually. Don't spend like a full 1 hour session letting someone try to under the legs pass you and you defend that. You'll probably end up with a sore back. In fact, even when Ari and I were working together and we're trying to figure out some of the things we're doing to defend under the legs passes, I know I started to get a sore back, particularly that week or two, and I had to back off and kind of gradually, build up to having a level of tolerance to that. So to make sure you don't go even as hard as I did in trying to make this instructional. But yeah, so you can focus a lot on the entries. If you can prevent people from entering, then you don't actually get stacked and get pressure on your back. And then the late stage recoveries, which again involves like relieving the pressure and trying to recover from there. And then as you gain your flexibility and confidence in the position, the mid-stage stuff, which is probably the most in-depth and important part to get good at, you can start to add that on as you go. Lastly, if you can stretch and do a good warm-up or stretch before you actually start training, you have a little bit more flexibility within the position when you're rolling, which is actually going to help a lot.
So now we're just going to be looking at the strategy you want to use for retaining against under the legs in regards to, say, your body type or your physical attributes. So if you're like a shorter, stockier body type and you're not as flexible, you're probably going to be relying on a lot more upper body predominant movements, like sitting up and framing and scooting your hips away. And you're also going to be looking at creating angles, really good angles, really early. Whereas a more flexible person, they're going to be relying a lot more on pummeling their legs and obviously using their flexibility. Now, it's not to say that as a longer and flexible person that you can be later with your reactions, but you probably have a bit more leeway in that sense. You can be a bit later and use your flexibility to bring your hips back in or your feet back in. So, for example, if Lockie starts to throw my leg across, if I'm a shorter, less flexible person, I'm probably not going to be looking to invert to square my hips back up or pull my foot to my chest. I'm probably going to be looking at trying to frame at the tricep to free my knee as I start to sit up. Okay. But if you're a longer person, more flexible, you're potentially not as explosive to do this, and you're probably going to have a bit of a tougher time sitting up and framing. You may be better off trying to square your hips back up and get your feet back inside, as an example.
Now going to go through some of the constituents of what makes a worsening under the legs pass. So these are things that the person on top is going to be looking to achieve, and if they achieve that, you're now in worse positioning. And again, this applies for the majority of different types of under the legs passes. Most of these are things they're looking to do along the way. So these 7 factors are clearing the feet, attaching to the hips, clearing the line of the knee, turning the hips, securing the angle, lifting or stacking the hips, and establishing chest to back or chest to chest connection. By clearing the line of the feet, this prevents Ari from being able to push me away and make distance. And it's going to be essential for the person to do to actually get the pass going. If Ari has a foot attached to me, I cannot actually enter an under the legs pass. So they're first going to be looking for this. Attaching to the hips, again, is very important, because if Ari's hips move back, it becomes harder and harder for me to get under the legs. The more he shuffles back, the more difficult that gets. So usually the person's going to look to attach to the hips, whether they're gripping onto the pants, particularly quite common in no-gi, in gi, or in no-gi, often it's by reaching a forearm over the top and locking back against the hip here. Again, if Ari tries to scoot his hip away now, that's going to be stuck, just like securing the hips here is. Getting your shoulder behind the knee line means that the ability to frame or free the knee is reduced. So Ari could be trying to frame with this knee and push in, almost like a knee shield, or he could be trying to free this knee. The person on top is usually looking to get their shoulder line underneath the knee. Once they've achieved this, both either framing with that knee or slipping that knee free is a much more difficult task. By turning the hips, and making Ari face away from me, his ability to pummel his feet back is drastically reduced. If he's able to move his hips and face me, then I'm in a lot more danger for this pummel from coming back. By reaching across and securing the angle, for example, with this grip, it means it's very difficult. So often like that could be in the gi, they're reaching to the far lapel, or no gi, that could be reaching across the stomach here to the far hip. Once they've got this, it makes it very difficult for Ari to reclaim the angle and turn his hips back to face me. Okay, so that's something the person on top will be looking for and something we're looking to prevent. Lifting the hips or stacking increases the amount of space I have to pass around. So I'm looking on top to pass under the legs, which I only have from right now while his hips are on the ground, I only have this space here. If I'm able to elevate Ari's hips, I now have all of this space under his back and the space under the leg as well. In addition, it removes the ability of the legs to pummel, which may be able to pummel here, but not while I've got the hips facing up towards the roof like this. By connecting my chest to either the back or Ari's chest, this really makes framing and that last stage quite difficult. So once I've connected here, if I start to try to pass now, I've got good connection and I've got a good ability to either take the back, or if I had to go on chest to chest, again, if Ari starts trying to frame away, I can really stick to it, okay? So whereas if the person on top tries to pass with the chest disconnected, the frames are going to be much more of an issue. So each of the things we just talked about, they might not happen in a linear fashion. The person is usually looking for any of those controls to occur at any particular point throughout the pass. So you need to be kind of understanding that they're looking for that and trying to battle to prevent that from happening.
Now we're going to be looking at a conceptual strategy for dealing with the early and mid stages of an under the legs pass. So there's 7 that we're going to be looking at. So first thing we're looking at is our arm positioning. Okay, so where are we framing our arms? How are we gripping? And like where are we framing? Which direction we're framing our opponent? The next thing we're going to be looking at is leg positioning. So how I'm using, say, my knees as a frame or a knee shield, or how I'm trying to make sure my knees are staying open so that it's harder for my opponent to scoop across my waistline. The next thing we're going to be looking at is the torso positioning. So making sure that our torso always stays in line between our legs, making sure that we're using our torso to help us create angles. The next thing is pummeling the legs. So how do we pummel our legs to recover our control with our feet? After this, we're going to be looking at preventing and dealing with the stack. So looking at stopping our opponent from lifting our hips off the floor, and then also dealing with a situation where our opponent has lifted our hips off the floor and looking at recovering from the stack. Then there's going to be preventing our opponent from creating an angle and how to recover once our opponent has created the angle. Then the last thing we're going to be looking at is how we free our knee leg. So now we're just going to be looking at our arm positioning and what kind of fights our upper body is going to be engaging in. So our hands, they can either be blocking our opponent, they can be pushing our opponent away, pulling them towards us, or even framing on own parts of our own body so it's harder for our body to get redirected or stacked. Okay, so let's say, for example, with the guard pass or going for an under the legs pass, maybe you started at the knee. Lockie's next goal here, if he is unable to stop me from cupping his knee, he wants to make sure that I can't progress to his hip. If I go to his hip, he wants to make sure his hands are ready to stop me from grabbing his collar. Okay, so they can be used to prevent the upgrades of grips. As well, he can use his hands, let's say I have double unders, he can use his hands to kind of make grips on my sleeves and also push me away and block me from continuing forwards to stacking. He can also, let's say for example, if I have his hips stacked up, he can also use his hands, sorry, we'll just turn this way, he can also use his hands to block my shins from progressing forward as well, which will help him bring his hips back down to the mat. Then as well, he can also use his hands to frame on his own body to either assist him with pummeling his legs or to stop his hips from getting redirected. So an example of this is, say, the high pummel. He can use his hands to grab his own shin to redirect his foot to a better position. Another thing as well is we can also use our hands to break the posture of our opponent, so it's harder for them to get posture to stack. Okay, so now as you can see here, it's really hard for me to actually lift Lockie's hips up.
Just talking about optimizing our frames and how to best use your frames. And this is we're going to talk about this before we then show you when and where to frame given specific scenarios. Okay. Now, just with this, a few really important things are, like, you can frame with 2 arms or 1 arm, but just be aware that often if your aim is to make distance, then often 1 frame can be better at that than 2. Okay. But there will be scenarios where we use both. But if I push with 2 frames here, I can only get so far forward, right? Like my shoulders, even just without Ari here, you see, if I'm flat on my back, 2 frames, I get to here. Choosing one side can allow me to drop my shoulder on the other side, and I can actually get more extension and more distance, which can be really important. Okay. Some other things that are going to really make a big difference are having your head on the mat and having pressure. Like, you want that to be a stable base to frame off. Okay, so that means if you lift your head up, or even if you look forward, it's kind of, you'll have a small amount of pressure through your head, and you can kind of get folded over your head. Right? If I look back, it becomes a stable base for my frame to work off. Okay, and I'm just going to show you this. I'll show you this with 2 frames, so you can see I've got both my shoulders off the ground here and my head up. If Ari walks forward, see, it tilts me back. And see how my scapula, the back of my shoulders, is now on the ground. So I just lost a lot of space. If we went back to where I started, my frames were here, and actually just stay where you are, don't move. My frames are here, and I've been rolled back to here. I've lost this space. He's this much closer to me. Okay. Whereas by having my head on the ground and my shoulders up, he won't be able to push forward and move through that frame. Okay. So obviously we want a straight arm frame. If you allow your frame to be bent, he's going to, if I frame with a bent arm, he's just going to collapse straight through that. Okay. So a lot of the time, if Ari's getting around the corner and I want to frame with 1 arm, I'll have this bent elbow situation where I want to frame his bicep, but look, it's bent. This is no good. Okay. So in that scenario, I need to shimmy my body away and my shoulder away and actually lift my scapula to lock that frame out straight. Okay. Now I can start to extend with it a lot better. Okay. So if I can just go without Ari for a moment. By pulling my shoulder towards my head, I get more chance. If I've got a structure here, pull my shoulder back, I'm more likely to be able to straighten my arm. Okay. Tilting my head away also secures that. Once I have that frame, I'm wanting to make as much distance as I can. If I can not just put my head to the ground, but tilt my head back towards and extend, I can make the maximum distance, giving more chance to free my arm. So let's look at that in practice now. I'm in a bad spot where my arm is bent. I tilt my head away, lock my arm straight, and now I want to make as much distance with this as possible. I bring my head back in and I depress my shoulder. Now I've got more room to actually start to free my legs and recover.
So you see, as I reach to this arm, my elbow is bent. So it's not like a particularly strong frame. But from the way I'm trying to move, so I want to curl my head towards this side so that for a few reasons. One, because Ari's trying to get around to this side. So I want to kind of move away and prevent him having that angle. But 2, I want to just bring my head to that side. So by reaching under my knee, it kind of can help me pull my torso towards that side. And that will elongate this frame. So it goes from being a bent arm to a straight arm, which makes it a lot stronger. Okay. So there we are. My head moves towards my knee. And now this arm is a lot more straight. Okay. So now it's like my skeletal strength. Pretty much. I mean, it can be slightly bent, but that's still good leverage. It's much harder for Ari to hold. And you can see actually the gap that frame is creating now. And now I can post off my head. And that frame is kind of like locked in now. So with my weight on my head, you can see the force can go all the way from the ground to my arm. It's very hard for Ari to close that distance here now, which means where my leg is, my hip can start to drop, or maybe the leg can actually be free to move out towards the side. There we are. Okay, so I move that leg out to the side now, and this shuts off his angle.
Okay, frames, where and when to use them. So we're going to kind of start at the very first frames we use and kind of work down from there. As a general rule of thumb, we always want to frame the body part that is leading first. Okay, so if Lockie starts to get a single undergrip and he's leading with his hip, I would look to frame at his hip first. If he were to be leading with his shoulder, I would frame at his shoulder. If he had, say, double unders and he was leading with his legs, I would frame at his legs, his lower shin. So kind of on the earlier stages of the pass, particularly with a double under or even a single under pass, if we have two sleeve grips, we're using these sleeve grips to kind of punch at the forearms to help create distance and stop our opponent from closing distance. One thing that we have to be conscious of whenever we're framing at our sleeves, our opponent may look to circle his hand to the inside and then break our grip, and then either establish the single undergrip, or they may even look to slide their shin over our bicep with their knee. So one thing that prevents this quite well is by making sure when we're framing, we connect our forearms towards our hips so that we're not allowing our opponent to swim his hand on the inside of our wrist and forearm. Okay, if I have space, Lockie can now circle and break. It's really important that we connect our forearms to our hips when we're framing away. From here, let's say Lockie starts to get a single under. Let's say his grip, he hasn't progressed the grip to the collar. Let's say he's starting cupping at the hip. This is where I'm going to be looking to frame at the bicep. Okay? When he starts to grip at the collar, I can still frame at the bicep, but sometimes, depending on where he's leading, I may have to frame slightly higher up towards the shoulder. My aim with this frame is to lock out my elbow, and I'm trying to create some space with this lock that he has on my hip. So if I frame at his wrist or at his sleeve, I'm actually tightening this underhook he has on my hip. Whereas if I frame at his bicep or sometimes at the shoulder, I actually create a bit of space between his elbow and my thigh, which he's trying to scoop. And this means there's actually space for me to recover my leg. Okay, so when I recover my leg, I'm actually taking my knee off of his shoulder and back underneath his shoulder. So it's harder for him to actually get a good single undergrip here. Just a quick note on the positioning of our frames. If we look at where I'm framing here, I'm framing at Lockie's shoulder. So this is not ideal because now you can see whenever Lockie starts to pressure into my frame, see how the force that he's exerting is kind of going like downwards, diagonally downwards. And this is kind of sticking me into the mat. Now, if I frame at the bicep, notice how when he starts to drive in, the force is kind of more in line or parallel with the mat. As you can see here, I'm starting to slide. So this is a much more ideal spot to frame when our opponent is looking for the single understack. If I start to frame really high, it's a lot easier for my shoulder to get collapsed, but also my hips start to come up. So as you can see here, when I start to frame at the bicep, the force that Lockie is exerting is more parallel with the mat. So now I will start to slide along the mat and I will be able to recover my grip. The next thing from here is framing on the legs. So it's not really with a single undergrip, but let's say Lockie is stacking with double unders. So go double unders. Sometimes if my opponent is leading more so with his legs, I will actually look to frame at the legs. Okay. Now with a double under scenario, if my opponent is tripoding and really leading with his upper body, I can look to frame both of his shoulders with both of my hands, like so. Then in regards to framing our own body, whenever our hips are getting redirected away, we want to start to frame our bottom leg. So if Lockie starts to redirect my legs, I want to support underneath my bottom leg towards the side that my hips are being turned towards. This is going to help me recover my bottom leg. So one of the common mistakes that we see when people try to frame their own leg, is that they try to frame their leg when their knee is very far away from their upper body. So it's really easy for Lockie to collapse my hips to this side because of how separated my upper body is from this leg here. Yeah. So if I can take my upper body towards this leg, I can connect my shoulder and upper body underneath my knee, so there's less separation, and I can really scoop my body underneath this leg. So it's going to be a lot harder for Lockie to collapse me when I'm like this, as opposed to like this. Okay. Now the purpose of going here is so that we can eventually bring our leg away from this horizontal plane into this vertical plane. And now it's really hard for Lockie to turn my hips this direction, as opposed to my leg being in this plane here. Another variation of this frame, as opposed to scooping underneath our leg, is to flare our elbow wide and post our hand underneath our knee. This will achieve the same thing in terms of stopping our hips from being collapsed to one side. Sometimes we'll be looking to frame underneath the elbow as well. Now, this is not something that we want to be constantly hunting for. It's only something we want to do when the elbow is exposed. Now, later on in this section, we're going to be looking at kind of the system of framing and pushing the elbow. The main idea with it is to obviously disrupt our opponent's shoulder positioning and elbow positioning to then free our knee. So sometimes we can use the elbow to do a sit-up and elbow push escape, or we can use the elbow to turn our hip in to free our knee. So in summary, we're looking to frame the nearest part of the body that our opponent is leading with. So initially, when Lockie gets grips on my hips, I'm going to be framing with my sleeve grips. Once he starts to scoop my leg, I'm looking to frame at his bicep. If his elbow is exposed, I'm looking to expose the behind his elbow. As he starts to get deeper into the single underpass, I'm going to start to frame at his shoulder and at his bicep. If he starts to lead with his hips, I'm going to be framing at his hips. If he is leading with his legs, I'm going to be framing at his shins. If my hips start to get turned away, I'm going to be looking to frame my own knee, my bottom knee, like so, or bringing my leg up high.
All right, we're now talking about what are we doing with our legs when we're defending under the legs passes. So the first 2 points that I want to talk about, actually we're going to discuss in a lot of detail later, so I'm just going to mention them now, and that is how to pummel your legs back in front and how to free your knee line. Each of these are very important goals with your legs, but that will be its own, they'll have their own section each. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is some of the other goals. With our legs, one of our aims is to prevent our opponent getting the angle. So I want to be stopping Ari from being able to get around the corner. We'll go through how to do that. I want to prevent myself from being stacked or actually offloading my legs so that Ari is unable to drive through them and not using them as a platform to stack my hips up. I'm going to be using my legs to try to create distance on my opponent, so my hips end up further away, which gives me a lot more space to use my legs. And I'll also be using my legs to create angles on my hips or recover angles. So I just want to talk about whether you want to have your legs wide or up on top of the shoulder. This is one of the first things to think about, and just the pros and cons of each. Okay. Now, generally, wide is going to be preferable, especially with like dropping your hips and having your legs wide. You create very little gap underneath your legs and the ground, making it very difficult for Ari to come around the corner and get that angle that he wants. Okay. So you can see here, if I have my legs wide and kind of dropping my hamstring over the top of the forearm here, if Ari tries to lift that and turn the corner, it's very heavy, okay? It becomes very difficult to do that. And actually the lower down this is, similar to what we're talking about with the frames, if he drives through that, it tends to more slide me. So if you're lifting, it tends to more slide me, having pressure going here, as opposed to my leg being up. If he pressures in, he's going to be more likely to stack. So one of the first things, and this is really important, as someone starts getting underneath your legs, one of the first things you want to be doing is going wide and dropping some weight on their forearm near the elbow. Okay, just don't go so wide that they can step over your leg. This is not beneficial either, especially for an over or under pass. So you just got to be wary that, you know, Ari is going to be trying to lift, and I can have my feet wide, pressuring that, making that difficult, and it makes it hard to get around the corner. This also makes it a lot harder to get stacked as well. Okay, as Ari drives forward, the lever is not there. Okay, if you think about the lever for bringing my hips up, the more my leg comes up, that's now a very good lever right at the top of the knee. If he drives through that, it starts to lift my hips up. Okay, whereas by having wide and low, that lever's not there. He can drive forward with his shoulders, and that's not going to lift my hips. It's going to slide me back. So generally we want our legs wide, but there is an occasion where we will try to put our foot up on the shoulder. First, I want to say, never do this if you don't have control of the same side sleeve. That will give Ari the angle to grip the far lapel, and now he's made it a lot worse for me. Okay, so I only ever put my leg on the shoulder if I have the same side sleeve grip covered. Okay, and sometimes you'll do this, usually not for a long time, but as a very brief motion to push back and give yourself room to start your pummel, which obviously we will talk about later. So again, as a general rule, both legs are going to be wide. If you do have both sleeves, there is a chance to start to use one leg as a pummeling mechanism. Now we can use our legs, not just the positioning allows us to slide, but we might actually want to walk backwards to move our hips backwards. And that's actually going to be little pulses from left to right. There's going to be some upper body work we have to do for that, for what we call the shoulder walk, which we'll cover a little later. But in terms of my legs here, by doing little pulses, so it's almost like I'm hipping out to my right and hipping out to my left. And each one of these will start to create an action. Okay, so Ari starts driving into me, and I can do this shoulder walk. Each one's very subtle, but it's like a small movement. If you try to do too big in one motion, it will kind of run out of steam. Now, one important thing to consider is try not to let your leg be a platform for them to stack, or a lever for them to stack you with. And this is where it gets really counterintuitive. But often actually, you'd be better off if you didn't have legs for a moment. in that because Ari's using this as a lever to stack me, so drive forward and stack. By levering that up, it starts to get my hips up. So often what we're actually trying to do is take pressure off our legs and have them float. Okay, if I can use my hands to take the pressure off, and now Ari can't drive into my leg, he can't lift my hips up, I can start walking back and getting good position. Okay, if you're always got some tension against your leg, I will get stacked. Okay, especially if I push against that will lift my hips up. Okay, so you often actually want to offload. It does require a bit of hamstring flexibility. Framing, offload allows the hips to drop and for your legs to get back into good position. So the last use of our legs is going to be to redirect our hips. So we've already covered the high pummel in terms of what we're doing with our frames, but obviously we know the movement for the high pummel, but if my hips are being turned, I can do the high pummel, and this will start to get my hips back facing towards Ari and not facing away. And another action we can do is the gongoa as well. So if my hips get turned, sometimes I can gongoa, and that will redirect and recenter my hips to face Ari rather than facing away. So in summary, with our legs, our primary aim is to use it to pummel and make space and get back, and to start to free your knee line. Again, we're going to be covering those particular topics a bit later. Otherwise, we're looking to prevent them getting the angle and prevent them stacking us by having our feet wide, heavy, and low, potentially using that to walk our hips back further, making it more difficult for our opponent. Occasionally, if you are controlling the grips, we can be putting our foot on the shoulder to assist us in making space. But otherwise, if our foot is on the shoulder, we're actually wanting to offload our leg. We're going to take pressure off our leg, kick it up so our hips can drop and start to get it back out down to the side. If we're getting redirected, then that's when we can use our legs for the high pummel to start to face our opponent again, or we can be potentially using the gongoa to get our hips facing as well.
Now we're going to be looking at torso positioning and how when we reposition our torso, we can put ourselves in a better spot to defend the guard pass. So the first example where we look at repositioning our torso is to stop some kind of stuck to create distance with ourselves and our opponent, between ourselves and our opponent, sorry. So in a scenario where Lockie is trying to stack me, I'm going to reposition my torso by shoulder walking. I'm going to start to move my torso away by shoulder walking. Now that my hips are flat, my torso is in a better position to defend the guard pass, in a better spot to pummel my legs and obviously stop the stack. The other example where we look at torso positioning is when our opponent starts to get a strong angle on us. So if Lockie starts to cut the corner, he's starting to get to a point where he's becoming perpendicular to me. So this is obviously a lot better for him in terms of finishing his guard pass, and it's a lot worse for me in terms of my frames. My frame is starting to collapse in this position. So I reposition my torso so that I'm parallel with my opponent, and now I can stretch out my frames and I'm in a safer spot to retain my guard.
I've had a few examples of reconnecting our torso positioning and basically just, whenever someone tries to get an angle, your aim is for you want your torso kind of 180 degrees from your opponent, and unless you're facing them and allowing like a more later stage recovery to occur. So you'll see a few examples here where I try to kind of change that, and Ari will kind of quite actively and aggressively fight to get his torso back. So you see here, I throw the hips to the side and I'm moving around towards the side of the camera. I really want that angle, and Ari will quite actively bring his head back in line 180 degrees from me, and where his legs basically in between each of his legs. Okay, so here, like so. Okay, he's quite active at fighting to get that angle back. Again, you can see I guess what you can see is the urgency he places on that being a high priority in preventing the pass from occurring. Here you can see I'm trying to lift Ari's hips up, and I'm getting some success right now, but the more he drops his hips to the ground, he's keeping his head on the mat, but the lower his hips get, the harder it is for me to lift and be effective with this. So you can see I'm driving, he's putting the back of his head on the ground, looking away from the camera, so he's starting to get this good posture through his spine. And then as he drops his hips and gets good torso position, which is now, okay, you'll see he starts to basically slide. As I drive forward, he'll just slide. Okay, and it ends up, my forward drive now doesn't even lift his hips. I end up just collapsing into him and having to reset and change my strategy.
A key component of recovering from under the legs passing is pummeling our feet back in front. That's what we're going to be talking about now. The different ways we can do that, the different setups and the different locations we can look in terms of when we are re-pummeling, making it very difficult for our opponent to re-enter when we do pummel so we can recover. And I think one thing to note is just on preventing someone entering an under the legs pass is be aware to have a foot in front. Okay, so a lot of the time it will occur that, like Ari might throw my legs to the side, and then as I gongoa, he wants to come under the legs. Okay, you need to be thinking about pummeling your legs early. We do that same action again. As I gongoa, I want to have like a foot folding in. It becomes very difficult to get underneath that leg, and that can start to set up my retention. Okay, so obviously we're doing it, we're going to be teaching as a retention tool, but you need to be thinking about preventing under the legs passes by folding a leg and getting something facing your opponent's torso.
So ideal foot positioning when we're pummeling our legs. So the ideal position is to have our foot underneath the armpit, so as if I'm lassoing the foot. We can look at hitting the foot on the shoulder or the bicep, but sometimes it's particularly when our opponent is going for like a tire foot kind of stack. If I just step on the biceps, there's nothing stopping my legs from still getting redirected up. However, if I hook at the armpit, now Lockie's armpit obstructs my shin from going over my head. So because of this reason, it's more ideal to have your foot lassoed through, hooking behind the shoulder under the armpit, as opposed to having your foot stepping on the shoulder or the bicep. Okay, it's not to say it's a bad spot, but if you were to choose between the two, this is a much safer option. As for where we can step our feet onto our opponent's body, so we've got the near side shoulder, near side bicep, near side armpit. Then we also have this cross side bicep or shoulder, or even sometimes the cross side armpit to free our knee length. So another spot that we have, it's also like a type of movement as well. It's as though I'm like throwing my leg over the top, almost as if I'm trying to do like a go-go platter. This is also a really helpful way of pummeling our legs back to achieve the inside space. This is potentially also preferable to stepping on the bicep, because once I use this kind of go-go platter leg pummel, I can actually start to get my foot on the inside of my opponent's torso. So I could be hooking the near armpit, or I could even go back to this armpit here as well. So if we look at the scenario of a tire flip, if I have the choice of stepping my foot to the bicep or throwing this like a go-go platter style pummel, I'm probably going to have a better outcome with the latter if I'm looking to use the go-go platter pummel, because as I start to throw my leg across like this, if Lockie starts to tire flip, I'm actually going to be able to get my foot on the inside of the armpit. So no matter how hard he flips my hips, I'm actually not going to get stuck. Whereas if I just choose like the shortcut of trying to step on the bicep, he's going to throw my feet back to the floor.
Ari's about to go through the different ways we can pummel our legs in front. I'm just going to kind of give a very brief overview before we get into it. So there are the standard style pummels where we're just trying to get our feet back in front, which can be to the near shoulder first, could be towards the far shoulder first. Sometimes we do this go-go platter style pummel where we tend to come over the top of the chin to pummel. We can sometimes be using a high knee shield to pummel. The gongoa motion may assist us in pummeling. We may be using the high pummel to pummel back, or we may use the hip swing as someone starts to scoop our leg to enter the under the legs pass.
Okay, so now we're going to look at different ways of going by our foot pummeling. Okay, so there's two ways of going by it. We can either use a frame to make distance, pushing our opponent away, and then pummeling, or we can move our own body into position for the pummel. Okay, you can sometimes use both at once as well. So first one I can do, if I have double sleeve, I can use the hamstring to push away and then pummel my foot back inside. Sometimes I can use my other leg to do that as well. So I can push away with my top leg and then pummel my bottom leg in. So another thing I could use is a knee shield to frame. So I can start to hip out, use my top knee as a knee shield so that I can free my bottom leg, and then get my foot to the bicep and pummel my other leg back inside.
So here we have an example of using the high knee shield frame. So I've managed to, in this case, Ari's under the legs, and I feel like I'm able to use, because of where his shoulders are, and he's kind of hidden his arms to frame off the arms too well, but I can frame these shoulders that could pressure in, and that gives me enough room to get a knee shield. Okay, so here I frame both shoulders, and it's made enough space that when I move my hips out, I get a little knee shield here, which keeps some distance and some ability to prevent Ari from closing the gap. Okay, There we go. Okay, so that knee shield really blocks that inward motion. And then obviously when you push with one leg, you can retract the other and try to get your other leg in front. There we are. Okay, so that's good. I've got a step on the bicep here, and that can let me push. Ari's trying to clear that, but in doing so, I managed to pummel underneath the armpit. So it should be much harder now to execute a under the legs pass. I move my hips out and recover. It's not the best angle to see this, but you'll see an example of me framing away here. So you see my hand comes up with that frame in a moment. There we are. And it pushes to make space, enough space for my foot to replace my arm frame. Once my foot's in place, I can use that to push, and I keep it on the shoulder to drop my knee down and recover. Just an example here. I've actually managed to stack Ari a little bit where his feet are floating, but he's still got good frames and his hips aren't too high. So I'd like to be stacking him further. And Ari is managing to kind of move his hips away. And as I'm just, it's my fault for, like, I'm kind of postured up, which is kind of what I need to do to have room to reach with my arms. And so if my head's down underneath, I kind of stick myself and I can't move either. Okay, so by posturing up, it gives me a chance to move, but it also gives Ari a chance to pummel. And he's going to use the Goga Plata style pummel. And we'll probably just talk about that here. You can see it probably might even be difficult. You can see Ari's knee can't move any further towards his chest. He might not have room. If he was to curl that foot, it might reach like here, but maybe not in front of my bicep or shoulder. But instead, by folding in front of my head and coming underneath the shoulder, he's actually got a space to pummel into. The other issue would be if he stepped on me, I could lift his hips and re-throw his leg over. So you see here, he decides to go in front of my head, and then his foot can then work to pummel behind my shoulder. So that basically kills my pass. We'll see a few examples of this. So again, look how hard that would be to step on my bicep there. He'd have to really be, it's not giving enough room in this scenario to do that. But folding across and then using the other leg to kind of give a little bit of room to tuck that foot underneath, and now I'm in trouble.
We can also use the high pummel as a means of obviously squaring up with our opponent, but also being able to allow us to pummel our feet back to a better position. So right now with this single under position, Lockie's got a deep underhook on my top leg, and he's pinned my bottom leg so my bottom leg being my right leg, and he's also turned my hips to my right side. So what the high pummel allows me to do is it allows me to redistribute where the weight is going through in regards to my hips. So the high pummel is going to allow me to take weight off of this hip, and it's also going to allow me to turn to square up with Lucky. So right now I'm facing away from Lucky. When I use the high pummel, I'm able to square back up with Lucky. So I'm high pummeling, I'm pushing with my top leg to create a bit of distance. I'm stretching my bottom leg towards my head, and I'm looking to scoop my arm underneath my leg. And now I'm trying to take my leg out of this horizontal plane and bring it into this vertical plane here. Now from here, I don't have as much weight going through this hip. Okay, all the weight is more so going through my knee and this shoulder here. Now what I can start to do, because this leg is still taking a bit of weight, I can actually take this leg off of his shoulder, which actually makes it a lot harder for him to generate force through this underhook. So he may still have the grip, but it's a lot weaker when my knee goes underneath the shoulder. Okay, when my knee is above his shoulder, his underhook is a lot stronger. So I'm taking my knee off the shoulder, and now it's a lot easier for me to pummel this leg. Okay? It's going to be a lot harder for me to pummel my leg when it's out here, but now that it's in this plane, it's a lot harder for Lucky to stop me from bringing my leg towards his torso. Okay, so I can look to bring my leg towards this shoulder, or sometimes even the far shoulder here. And I'm creating just enough space for me to get this foot back inside, and then for me to be able to bring my foot back underneath the armpit. Common mistakes with the high pummel against an under the legs pass. So firstly, a lot of people, they forget to take their bottom leg, the pinned leg, out of this horizontal plane, and they also forget to connect their upper body towards their lower body. It's kind of the same thing. So if I just try to high pummel in this plane here, my leg is going to remain pinned onto the floor. So if I can take my upper body towards my lower body, as well as get my arm underneath this leg, it's going to be a lot easier for me to take this leg into the vertical plane. Then the next thing as well is not addressing the stack whilst high pummeling. So obviously once we're here, we're at risk of a stack. So if I don't actually address the stack, my opponent is just going to continue to walk my hips up and off the mat. So once I'm here, I need to be actively trying to bring my hips back down to the mat and make myself into a board. So extend my lower spine like so. Then the last thing is a lot of people will forget to take this knee off of the shoulder. So the guard pass is always going to have a lot of leverage with this single underpass and stack if my knee is higher than the guard pass's shoulder. The second I take my knee off of the shoulder and start to bring it below the shoulder towards the elbow, it actually starts to put more stress on his shoulder and his grip, and it's a lot harder for him to actually complete the pass. Now from here, it's a lot easier for me to bring this hip back down to the mat and then start to pummel my feet back towards the inside. Another common mistake that people make is not framing at the bicep of the underhooking arm. So if I do everything right and I start to pummel and I'm defending the stack, if I haven't started to frame at the bicep here, Lockie can start to connect this knee to my chest. And this is obviously going to make it a lot harder for me to defend the stack pass. And also it's going to be a lot harder for me to block him from creating an angle and cutting the corner. Another thing as well, when I don't frame on this bicep, it's actually a lot harder for me to take this leg from above the shoulder to below the shoulder. If I just try and remove this leg now, because he's closed this space between this arm, particularly his bicep, forearm, and my thigh, now it's really hard for me to lift this leg off the shoulder. When I frame, I actually create some space for my leg to go underneath the shoulder. And now it's a lot easier for me to do my high pummel defense.
Here you'll see an example of the high pummel. I starting to turn Ari's hips, trying to get his leg on my shoulder. He's going to get his leg wide on my arm. There we are. So the leg goes wide, and he's going to be able to do a nice high pummel with his right leg here. There we are. Good. And it chops back in front onto the inside of the bicep in this particular instance. So again, Ari gets his leg wide, brings his leg up nice and high in line with his hips. So you can see how his leg was out wide here, and he wants to pull that more in line with, with his hips, with where his head and shoulders are. So he pulls his leg up in that plane. And because of this pressure he's got here, you can see his legs wide, and he's pulling on my my sleeve here as well. It's kind of pushing me away. I can't actually close. I would want to put my head forward and down, so this foot can't come in front. But this is actually like this pressure coming from the leg and the sleeve grip is kind of like pulling me back and away from the leg, which actually gives him plenty of room to pummel. And there we are, back to guard.
The next movement is the hip swing, and this is commonly used when our knee of the leg that is being scooped is free, and also just in general when our hips are free. So if our opponent isn't really controlling the other leg as well. So a common scenario for this is maybe, let's say, Lucky starts to attack maybe a bullfighter pass, and I start to square up again, and he starts to go underneath my legs. Okay. Now, if my knee is free in this scenario here, I can use this hip swing. So I take my hips all the way through, and because my knee is below his shoulder, I can spin all the way through and recover back to underneath the armpit or feet on the biceps. So again, the hip swing is an inversion where our knee is free and our opponent doesn't have control of our other leg. So as he starts to try and scoop our leg, we can start to spin all the way through. The other movement we can use is the gongoa movement. And so the idea behind this is to create as much space as possible with our hips so that after we finish the gongoa movement, we can start to pummel our feet back inside. Common scenarios from the double unders, if someone throws my hips to one side, I use the gongoa movement to bring my hips back down to the mat and away as far as possible from my opponent so that I can start to bring my feet back to either the biceps or underneath the armpit. So you want to make sure that you're using the gongoa in a reactive manner. You don't want to be trying to initiate the gongoa when your opponent hasn't actually thrown your legs by. So if I just try and pass my legs across to spin through, I'm actually putting myself in a really bad position for the guard pass. However, like I mentioned before, if my opponent throws my hips, then I want to be using the gongoa as a reaction. So a common mistake that a lot of people make with the gongoa movement against this particular attack is just simply going back to a square position, as opposed to trying to go a little bit further and exaggerating the roll. So let's say if I just aim to land directly back in front of my opponent, my hips are still going to be quite high. However, if I aim for my hips to be a little bit further on the outside of my opponent, it's actually going to be a lot easier for me to get my hips lower to the mat, and also it's going to be a lot harder for my opponent to catch me in a stacked position. So as Lucky goes through, if I really shoot my hips far back like this, now my hips are on the outside of Lucky's, it's a lot easier for me to create the angle to step on the shoulders. And it's a lot harder for Lucky to catch me with my hips up in the air. So it's essentially it's basically a race between the guard passer and the guard player. Basically, whoever can get to this side of the hips from the throw by attempt. So if I'm slow with my gongoa movement, I will get caught with my hips quite high in a stack. However, if I'm faster than the guard passer, my hips should be able to hit the mat and I should have a better angle to bring my feet to the inside.
Here's a great example of the gongoa action as a way to recover, and it happened quite fast, but we'll play that again. So you see Ari ends up recovering from here. So I'm under the legs here, and I try to, on top, I try to pull Ari's hips in and then throw him to the side, because then that's going to give me, I want the angle. I want to get side on. I want to be able to reach my hand across the body. You can see right now where he's holding that. There's no way if I tried to reach to there, it would be a failure. So I kind of pull him in like this. Okay, I grip his leg, pull him in, and then I want to reach around now. It's going to be like I've got more space. I'm a little more secure because I'm close to his hips. Like I've got more freedom to try to reach for that. But Ari's going to throw his head in, and his hips end up really out to the side. So I lose any chance of getting that angle. Watch this. So he puts his bottom leg on the ground, pushes off, and his hips are coming out to the side here. Okay, so now I lose a lot of that angle. I try to pin that leg, and then as I pin it, he does one of our defenses from through the leg section. He off balances me and ends up recovering. Okay, so once more, if you watch that gongoa action, as I pull the hips in and try to turn, he uses the gongoa to get his hips back out, and that's a really good upgrade for Ari.
So to put into context, when we use these different kinds of leg pummeling approaches, firstly with the standard leg pummeling, it's going to be really hard for me to just try and pummel to the inside if my opponent is just holding me in the double unders pass and not doing anything. I can look to frame with maybe like a shoulder post, or even use my leg to push away, but even then it can be quite hard. My opponent is solely just trying to stall and not do anything. These opportunities start to open up when my opponent starts to make some kind of movement to progress the position. So maybe he starts to lift. This is when I can start to throw my leg across or post on his shoulder and create a bit of space to pummel my feet back to the inside. Maybe my opponent looks to throw my hips away. This is when I can use my gongoa roll to recover. My opponent looks to throw his hand across my center line. I can start to use this to take advantage of the space he's created. When we're in the single under position, this is where we can start to look at the high pummeling position to pummel the feet back to the inside. And lastly, we can use the hip swing off our opponent's entry to the under leg pass.
We're now talking about preventing the stack, so preventing yourself from getting your hips lifted up and having your opponent getting behind your lower back with your lower back exposed like this. Okay, so there's a few ways that people can stack, and it comes down to they've got two mechanisms they can do this. They can either work from pushing your legs forward to lift your hips like so, and that could be at the feet or the knees. Or they might be trying to lift your hips up from the hips, which is more almost like pulling them to you. Okay, so we break that down into 4 different individual types of passes or ways of doing that. There's the double ankle stack, where people tend to work at the ankle here and drive forward. Okay, and once the hips are lifted, they'll try to usually settle back down and start trying to get chest to back and work from there. There's using the legs or the knees as the lever here. So this could be from a single under. Someone might walk forward like this, driving forward on the knee, lifting the hips up and getting good position there. Or sometimes that's double unders as well, and kind of walking forward into a tripod sort of posture, again with your shoulders driving the knees towards the chest to lift the hips. Okay? And then the other types tend to be more about actually lifting the hips themselves. So you get, sometimes people will go under the legs, sit back, start to pull your hips up and start lifting from here. It might even be that they stand. You might even stand up, pull and lift the hips like that to get the stack. And a pretty common one is, let's just shuffle back a bit. Pretty common one is to bridge in with the hips. So often, if they're in a low posture, they'll bring the hips under yours and lift your hips using a bridge like this. And then as Ari resets from that by using the gongoa, they'll look to get chest to back from there. So in terms of understanding how to prevent being stacked, we're going to approach it from 6 different key factors. That is your posture. So we're generally having our head down, our back flat and using frames from there. There's your opponent's posture, how we can try to affect their posture and limit their ability to do the stack pass. There's dropping your hips, so making sure that if your hips are lifted, you can drop your hips back down to the ground and eliminate the stack. Framing, so how are we going to frame to prevent ourselves from getting stacked? How to move your hips backwards. So generally, the more I move my hips backwards, the harder it is for Ari to elevate and lift my hips driving forward. And lastly, the role of flexibility. So how can we improve our flexibility, or what areas do we want to be flexible with to make it more difficult for someone to stack us? So first, let's talk about your posture. And we already talked about this a bit, but to prevent the stack, you want to be more like a board than a ball. Okay, so I don't want my hips up already, and I don't want my upper body curled. This is actually usually a good posture when someone's trying to go around the legs, but from here, when they're under the legs, Ari, if he drives forward, it really rolls me up and my hips will lift. Okay, I want to maximize my ability to slide on the mat, so I'm actually actively like curling my hips down heavy on the mat, and I'm actively putting pressure through my head too. So now if Ari starts walking forward, it should slide me along the mat. In terms of my legs, I want, ideally to prevent being stacked, I want my legs wide. Okay, below the line of the shoulder and wide. Again, now when he drives into me, the force is more in line with my body. Okay, whereas the more my leg is on the shoulder, it's a bigger lever. If he drives forward, it starts to elevate my hips. So anytime you notice your leg is getting to the shoulder, you want to have a good ability to try to get yourself back into good posture. That can usually mean framing so that they can't, if there's pressure on your leg, you can't necessarily like keep that tight, or even go single under, for example. Like if there's pressure on that leg, I can't just move it laterally. By framing and getting your leg back further than your arm, it gives you some freedom to move. Okay. Once you have that freedom, if you have a way of moving your hips, which we will talk about a little later, if you have a way of moving your hips, you can often start to get your leg wide again. Okay. So if someone gets under your hips and your legs are on top, we're going to be looking to get our legs wide again. Lower back on the mat and hips heavy on the mat, back of your head on the mat. Okay. Another thing with the head on the mat actually, which is really important, even where you look, you want to look almost like up or backwards. That means I can put a lot of pressure through my head onto the ground. Okay. It's actually like an active extension here. If I'm looking at Ari like this, start stacking, it tends to like lift me up more. Actually, I'll keep my lower back down and drive forward. It tends to like be a weak action of the neck, and you can still get folded over that. By actively putting pressure, by looking back and going like this, if you go again now, it really should slide and make my hips feel even heavier. Just an additional note on posture. It's actually, you want your hip on the ground and your head on the ground. It's not a flat back in that I'm pushing my lower back down and curl. If I do that, I'm actually starting to curl, okay? So you should actually, if you put your hand behind your back, it should be able to slide under nice and easy under your lower back. If you're pushing your lower back flat, that probably means you're easier to stack, and that will get jammed if you try to do that. Okay, so it's an active push down with your hips and arching your back with your head on the mat.
This clip gives a good idea of the posture we want to use. So you see Ari's under the legs. I'm framing with my hands, but I'm putting my head down to the mat and I'm looking backwards. Notice, throughout pretty much most of this, I actually don't look in the direction of Ari. That would take my head off the mat and take pressure off my head, which means it's going to be much easier to roll me up and actually stack me. So I'm looking backwards most of the time. Okay. In addition to that, I'm trying to drop my hips. I'm trying to find ways to clear my legs off the shoulders so he can't stack, get wide, and actively pull my hips down towards the ground. Here we are. Okay, so now I'm pushing. He's obviously like working to stack me, and you'll see I'll kind of work from here to try to take those hips back down. And I'll do that again in a moment. He's trying to lift, and I try to force those hips back down. And you'll see I actually recover when my hips drop. See, as my hips drop, I start to get my feet back in front in a position where I can start to recover like so.
Now we'll talk about our opponent's posture. Generally, we can make it difficult to stack if we break our opponent's posture down further. So if you look here, Ari's got his, you can get his shoulder up near my knee, and that's a good lever to stack. If I'm able to pull down, so it could be a cross grip or a grip over the top of the collar, if I can pull his head down and be a little more like this, he's lower down. He can't, even if my leg was up, he's got less leverage than if his shoulder came right behind my knee. Okay, so we can kind of pull down, and if you try to stack now, Ari, it should be very difficult to get good pressure for that. As I said, it can be over the top or with a cross grip, or obviously no gi, that could just be a grip around the head. You have to be wary of them standing up as well, so the kind of posture and lift. So if Ari stands up to lift, like so. Okay, if we go back. When you've got good control of your opponent's posture, like this, if Ari tries to do that same thing, it's going to be difficult to do. Okay? I can be pulling down with my elbow rowing past my body, and he never actually gets to separate his head from where my hips are. So how's he going to, if you think about it, he wants his chest on my back, like he wants to expose my back so his chest can go there. But I'm kind of forcing his chest over the top of my stomach and keeping it there. So no matter how much he tries to lift and elevate, if I'm able to keep that posture broken here, it's going to be a very difficult task. Another thing we can do to especially prevent the lifting style stack, where Ari will step up and start to lift my hips up like so. Okay. Now if you just stop here, notice how he's pulled my hips very close, like underneath, like almost on top of his legs. So my arms have come very close to the legs here. This is good structurally for Ari. He can hold this for a very long time. Everything's nice and tight. His elbows are tight to his hips. It will be very heavy for him if you mess with their posture and you don't allow their legs to come close to your hips, or as close to the hips. So if Ari steps forward now and starts to lift, but I'm able to keep his legs away, he's going to find that, you see he's starting to reach more far away from his hips, and that becomes more difficult. So if you try to lift from there, Ari, okay, more difficult. He has to posture a lot and usually give up a lot of space to pummel. Okay, so we can affect their posture by making them come more forward if we block their hips and limit their ability to build their base underneath where they want to lift from. So the difference there is as if you're trying to lift a weight, and obviously when people lift weights, they have it nice and close to their shins to start. If you were to block that and make them reach from here, most people wouldn't be able to lift nearly the same weight, because the moment arm here, the distance from where the weight is and where the hips are is greater than here, where they've got a lot more power. It should feel less because there's less moment arm working against. So we'll now talk about dropping your hips. So if you're starting to get your hips elevated, how do we drop them? Okay, so as Ari starts to put pressure here, he's obviously, when he wants to stack, and this we're talking about like when he's driving forward off the knee here, or could have been even with a double ankle stack. What's lifting me, or where the leverage is coming from, is this knee. The pressure here is bad, and that's lifting my hips. If you were to fight that, if I try to push back against that, look what happens. My hips will come right up. This is terrible. Okay, so actually the more I give him like the ability to put pressure onto my leg, so by pushing back, the worse this gets to me in terms of the stack. I want to alleviate as much pressure as possible to keep these hips on the ground. So to do that, with our frame, we've got two different things we can do. We can try to move our hips backwards, which gives me more room with my legs, and it's more difficult to lever off this leg. But I can also just try to take this leg back too. So if I can frame with my hands, usually a bit higher, because if you frame too, in a scenario like this, if you frame too low, actually you have to weigh it up. If you frame low, it tends to slide you more. But if you frame high, it can offload your legs a bit more. And this is going to allow me to drop my hips. When I take pressure off my legs, I can drop my hips down, and then we can get a better position to start to defend and prevent the stack. So the eventual aim in terms of offloading our hamstrings and pulling back like this is to drop the hips and also to eventually get our feet wide where we can have a better position for them not to be able to drive and lever off.
So we'll have a look at a few things related to the stack and preventing the stack in live footage. So first off, you can see my hips are starting to lift here, and that's a problem. And there'll be a few things I can do here. I am doing a little bit of a head walk, and notice, I mean, this is where the more flexible you can get through your hamstrings, the less you have to lift up, but you'll see occasionally my toe will hit the mat, which kind of is a block to my hips further lifting. But I'm also pushing on this leg, trying to drop my hips down. When you'll see when I drop my hips, that's my best chance to actually recover, because R is up quite high on my leg, which is actually good leverage to force a stack. Okay, so here, and as I push, my hips have started to drop down. Okay, so now there's a big distance between where R is, and as my hips drop, it's going to let my knee start to free where I can start to recover. There we are, and you see my knee is now free, and that's actually how I got out of that stack. So here, there's an active, like I'm actively pushing my hips down to the ground. You have to actually like focus on this. It's not just like a relax. Then you actually be actively pushing your hips down. It makes a huge difference in scenarios like this. Head's on the ground, and bin here is trying to stack. You'll see I keep adjusting my head, trying to constantly slide my hips backwards. The further my hips go back, the harder it is for bin to get underneath them and actually lift. See a little head walk. You can watch that head walk again. See, using my head to actually move me backwards as I frame. Now from here, pushing the legs. See, as bin goes to lift, when I push the shins, it forces my hips to drop back down. Okay, and that's actually, he's lost his grip just by me dropping. Okay, and his hands come out, and that's going to actually what gives me a chance to recover. So I off balance now and recover. Here, I try to lift Ari's hips up, trying to get underneath. You know, I want to keep him up or maybe get his feet to the ground so I can get my chest behind his back. He's going to push on my legs here, and that forces me. See how did you see his hips move away? It becomes a lot heavier. So I'm just going to talk about my lower back here. This is my lower back. So this is the line from, you know, where my lower back is to the ground here. And this is where his hips would be if they were where I wanted to. So they'd be about here. By pushing his hips further back, you can almost double the distance, which kind of doubles the load that you're lifting in terms of the amount of work your back has to do. So that's basic physics, but you double the moment arm, you double the load. So by pushing his hips back to here, it's going to be way heavier for me to lift than if I was able to keep my arms tight to my hips. Okay, so I'm trying to pull up close. His hips move away like that, and you can see I drop. I lose the ability to hold the hips, or at least it becomes a lot heavier. Okay, and look, are his hips going as close to the ground as he can? They'll probably hit the ground in a moment. Head's on the mat, and he's not looking at me. He's looking kind of backwards, because you have to actually put some pressure through that head. You don't look at your opponent in this scenario. There you go. Hips are to the ground. There you go. Hips go to the ground, and that lets him recover.
One thing we want to do is be moving the hips backwards, and one of the best tools we have for that is the shoulder walk. There's also something called the head walk. Okay. Now, first of all, you need some pressure from your opponent to be able to achieve this. Okay. If Ari's just sitting here on his own weight, and I try to shoulder walk, I'm just going to kind of dance on the spot. Okay. I need some pressure driving into me. That's what he's trying to do anyway to lift my hips up. So as he's trying to lift my hips up, I can start doing the shoulder walk. That's where I put my head on the mat, and each shoulder blade kind of lifts and drops. Okay? So if you imagine, there's a little bit of a side curl, like my body swings to the side. Each time I swing to the side, you'll have a shoulder that ends higher. That one should plant to the mat. Once that plants to the mat, I swing the other shoulder higher. Okay? Plants, swing the other shoulder. And you should get some movement from doing that. Now, in addition to that, you've got your legs. Okay, so they can help with this kind of push-pull. Drive in again. All right. So Ari's really trying to drive and stack me, and my legs can help as well. And you see my hips move further away. This becomes very heavy and very difficult to stack, and gives me a great chance actually. If you walk far enough, you make enough distance that you can put your feet back in front of your opponent to recover. There is one other type of walk you might do. Sometimes both arms are occupied, especially like if you feel like they've got a lot of forward pressure, like, and you're having to frame the shoulders, for example. So if I'm up like this, I'm trying to block his shoulders from pressuring in. Okay. Here, if I try to shoulder walk, each time I bring my shoulder up, I actually I collapse the frame a bit. You see that he gets a bit closer each time my shoulder comes up. I actually want my shoulders kind of like pushed out to press in, making as much distance as possible. Okay. So again, if I pull that back, he gets closer. I want to keep them out, but I still want to slide backwards. And that's where we can do the head walk. So Ari's driving in, I look down to put the one part of my head on the ground, and then I slide back like this. Okay. Again, if Ari's pressuring, looks silly, but it is effective. And you can be using that to then start framing in the car and dropping your hips.
Here you'll get to see some good examples of the head walk, which helps me move the hips back, especially in the second clip actually. So you can see I'm using my head there a couple of times to walk, and a little shoulder walk as well. Okay, so see the difference? There's a head walk and a shoulder walk. So I'm using my head as I frame with both arms. I'm using the head, and then, sorry, shoulder walk was a fraction later. There we go. Okay, so the shoulders, lifting one shoulder up and down once more. This is they can be more pronounced, and this is quite subtle, but that helps me move my hips backwards and drop my hips to the ground. And there was also the head walk a bit earlier. You'll see another head walk in a moment, which is usually when you have to engage two frames quite strongly. Okay, so here we are. I'm engaging my frames. I'm extending my shoulder away from my body. I don't want to do the shoulder walk here where I then have to take that shoulder all the way back down to the ground. I want to walk back using my head. There we go. And you see that moved my hips back and made them heavier. And I can start to drop my hips. I'll do a high pummel there to recover. So you'll see eventually it allows my right foot to come in front. And just at the end here, you'll see as I drop my hips, so my hips are pretty low, not as low as they could be, but the room here is enough for me to push. I've cleared that grip, so he's no longer holding onto my hips, and I can retract my right foot back in front.
So the last point about preventing getting stacked and removing yourself from the stack in terms of dropping your hips is framing and where you frame. Okay, so if Ari starts to stack me here like this, so you can see my hips are lifted, I'm going to want to push in the line of the ground pretty much. Anything I can capture in this line is going to help my hips move back, and when the pressure comes off Ari's shoulders and the hips move back, that's when they're going to drop. So for example here, if it's just his legs are out of the way but his arms are available, I can use that to start to drop my hips, okay, by pushing back here. Okay. Obviously, that said, sometimes you're more worried about the pressure driving from the shoulders into the knees. Sometimes you'll be framing against the shoulders, so your hips and legs can be free. Okay, and sometimes Ari will bring his legs really far forward. For example, if he's trying to lift, or if I'm already in a stacked position. Often framing anywhere here is no good. I want to get more in line with the ground, push, try to drop my hips back down, and then I can reset into better position.
Some more clips of preventing being stacked. So again, framing as low as I really can on Ari's arm. Anything lower than that wouldn't really have any purchase. And his feet are way too far out of the way, and I'm trying to drop my hips to the ground. My head's on the mat here. Okay, and that's managed to drop my hips. Okay, or almost. Okay, as I slide back against that force, because you can see how I'm really like a board, not a ball, as we said. And there we are. Hips drop, and then that's going to allow my foot to come over the top and start to recover. Or my leg to go wide, and once I'm here, very difficult for Ari to stack. He does lift, okay, but I can push, drop my hips. When I push, it drops my hips back down, and that's how I try to recover from.
Now we're just going to look at the mobility required to defend the stack. So the positions that we want to have good flexibility and range of motion in is firstly our hip flexion, so ability to pull our knees towards our shoulders. Then our hamstring flexibility, which is basically when I have my knee to my chest and I start to straighten my knee. When I straighten my knee, I will start to feel more tension throughout the hamstring. So the reason why hamstring flexibility is important, as Lucky mentioned earlier, if I can get my toes to the mat without my hips lifting off the mat as high, then it's going to be a lot better for me. Okay, so this is where hamstring flexibility is really important. So if I don't have good hamstring flexibility and my hamstrings they have so much tension that I can only bring my knee to about here, then if I start to get stacked, my hips are going to come off the mat. And my feet only hit the mat once my hips come up really high. However, if I have really good hamstring length, my hips only come up to about this length here because my feet are touching the mat and pushing off the mat so that Lockie can't lift my hips further up. Okay? You have to make sure when you're here that you're not just straightening your knees, but you're actually trying to push your butt back down to the mat. If I just straighten my knees and Lockie stacks me up really high, I can still have my hips lift up really high. But if I push off the mat and I try and punch my hips back down to the floor, this is where I can really make good use of my hamstring flexibility. So I'm pushing off the mat and I'm punching my hips down to the floor. And I'm doing that same thing that we mentioned earlier of extending at my neck so that I'm looking up and it's easier for me to slide upwards along the mat. So one other position that we want to be flexible in is our ability to externally rotate our hip whilst also flexing the hip. Okay, so external rotation, as we mentioned before, bringing our knee towards the outside and our foot towards the inside, whilst also flexing our hips, so pulling our knee towards our shoulder. If I have good dexterity in this plane here, you can see the pathway of my foot. It's going to make it a lot easier for me to swim my foot all the way back through to a much safer spot to get inside control with my foot underneath the armpit. So this is usually something that you can catch either before your opponent stacks you, sometimes while he's stacking you if you're quick enough, or usually after you've recovered from the stack. So let's say Lockie started to lift my hips up. I'm using my hamstring flexibility to make sure my hips aren't lifting too high off the floor. Once I bring my hips back down to the mat, I'm looking to use my hip external rotation to swim my feet back to a stronger and safer position.
One thing the person often looks to do to stack is get the forearms hooked underneath the hips. Okay, you can see now as Ari walks forward, it elevates the hips. Okay, this is often very important for this tripod style stack where he can just go here and walks the hips up. Okay, and that's actually different to driving through the knee as the lever. It's now the hip as the lever. Okay, so we can, just when we're playing with our grips and we go back, obviously once he's got that, it's harder to clear. But when I've got the sleeve grips, if you put your hands on the inside, like we said before, it makes it hard for him to lock his forearms underneath the hips. So if you try to do that tripod walk now, Ari, you see my hips stay low, they don't lift. So he's come forward, but it hasn't been very useful. Okay, hasn't lifted my hips like he wanted. If I allow those forearms underneath the lower back, he starts to come up. Okay, so if you do get there, if we go back, if you do get someone with their hands underneath your back and you get sleeve grips, like try to work a little angle to get inside the forearms and prevent that stack being an option.
So one thing that we can do, if we can't get our forearms to the inside, maybe we're too late, What I actually want to do is I want to bring my hips back in between his forearms as opposed to sitting on top of his forearms. Okay, so once I'm here, I'm actually going to pull the sleeves, and similarly to what we were trying to do with the recovering from the stack, we're trying to put our hips back onto the mat. So as I pull at the sleeves, I'm aiming to flare out his elbows and bring my hips back down to the floor like so. And even though it's such a minor thing, it actually makes a huge difference against someone that's really trying to pull your hips on top of their thighs, kind of like how a lot of people will go from the double unders from their knees like so. This is obviously not an ideal spot to be in. You can see when Lucky pulls my hips up like this, it's really easy for him to actually elevate my hips. The second I feel this, I'm always trying to flare his elbows out and bring my hips back down to the floor. So really make sure that you're pulling the sleeve grips outwards, and you're also trying to take your knees to the outside of the shoulders, so your knees slip underneath the shoulders. Okay? And then once you can clear the pathway of the forearms, once you can create enough space with the forearms, you can put your hips back down to the mat. So pulling outwards, opening the knees, and really punching your hips back down to the floor. Like so.
So to summarize how to defend or prevent getting stacked, we want to have good posture. So we want to have our legs wide, hips pressing down to the mat, and head down to the mat. So we've got good position, and it's very difficult to drive through. If I can also potentially play with Ari's posture by keeping his head low or keeping his feet from coming close underneath him, so it's difficult to lift. Okay. I want to be trying to drop my hips. To drop my hips, I want to make sure the pressure is off my hamstrings. Okay, so I'm taking my feet backwards, making sure my frames can reinforce that. That will help me drop my hips. Other things that help me drop the hips are moving backwards. So using the shoulder walk, moving backwards, or potentially the head walk too, if there's a lot of pressure driving towards you and you need your arms and frames to prevent pressure on the legs. So then there is where do we frame or where do we grip? We can prevent them from getting underneath our hips by pulling the arms wide, or from having our hands on the inside of the forearms here. I can be framing low. So if I frame somewhere low, it helps me slide. So if Ari starts trying to drive and my frames are low here, keep walking, and it'll slide a lot easier. Okay? Same thing with the legs. Anything we can push down here is in a good plane to help us go low. If he's really leading with his shoulders, for example in this scenario, and like pressuring off your leg, you might want to be framing the shoulders to take pressure off your leg. You can get it back in good position and focus on dropping your hips. Again, if your hips are stacked and they actually have got you up here, then we want to be using our flexibility, trying to post on the mat, frame somewhere low. Usually the legs is ideal. Sometimes it's low on the bicep too. Push and really look at the head extension like that, as well as a push to try to drop my hips back down, clear it from the chest, and I'm back into a more safe position. If someone starts to lift your hips and do the kind of throwing the hips tool, we want to be using the gongoa to not only hip out, but drop our hips heavy and get back into good position.
Now we're going to cover defending the stack where people C-grip under the ankles and push the feet to the floor. So obviously the very first thing we're trying to look at is keep the feet on the biceps or shoulders or hips, and even better is going underneath. So now the C-grips won't work. Usually what's going to happen is, as my opponent is pummeling my feet off the bicep, and as I'm trying to pummel back, this is usually where they will look to catch the C-grips. And they're usually trying to catch it when my knee is quite extended. Okay, so maybe as I'm going from a fully flexed knee to a straightened knee, this is probably where they're going to look to catch the C-grip stack. So as Lucky starts to stack, he's taking my feet into this vertical plane here. When my leg is still in this kind of angle of knee flexion, I have a chance initially to fight his stack. I can bring my heel back down to my butt, and I can start to fight against the C grip. With some people though, they'll still be able to extend your knee. But once your feet start to pass, I would say maybe around your chest, the line of your chest, this is where it's going to be really hard for you to actually defend and resist. If I keep trying to push, I'm actually just going to get stuck. So at about this point here, once my feet pass the line of my chest, I'm looking to change the plane that my legs are in. Now, again, like I mentioned before, if I just try and resist and bend my knee directly against Lucky's hand, it's pretty much impossible for me to resist. So we're going to look to try and change the plane that we're fighting in. So I'm going to bring my foot across my body like so, making sure my knee is not going across my body. And now, in this plane here, it's really hard for Lockie to resist me bending my knee. So when I externally rotate my hip and then bend my knee, it's really hard for someone to actually bring my leg back into a straightened position. So this is what I'm looking to do anytime my feet pass the line of my chest. I look to take the fight to a horizontal plane. It's really awkward for Lockie to maintain that pressure. And if he continues to push down, he actually just shoves my foot towards my chest. So right now, when he's pushing down, he's extending my knee. When he pushes down now, he just externally rotates my hip. Now that I'm here, I can look to take my knee back to my hip back to a neutral position, and then I can stick my feet back into the bicep or hook underneath the armpit. Then I aim to do this with this foot as well. Externally rotate and then re-pummel. So at full speed, it should look like so. Now, what can happen if you aren't as confident with your flexibility, or maybe you feel your opponent is very strong in this position, you can use your hand to guide your foot towards your chest and then back to the biceps. Same with this foot as well. So what can happen if you're too slow, if you're too late to recover both legs and you just recover the one leg? You can see here, this leg is now not blocking Lockie from running around this direction. So people may try to attack, like it's kind of like a modified bullfighter, and they're going to hope to get some kind of stack off of this. So what I aim to do from here is to frame and to spin, kind of like a gondola roll, making sure I get my hips out and back to the mat. And now I'm in a much better position to stretch my legs to hit the biceps. The other thing we can look to do is, as our opponent is trying to stack and we bring one of our legs across, we can look to frame at the shins. And now I can start to spin either towards or away from my opponent. If I spin away, I'm looking to spin my hips all the way past his hips to recover my guard. And if I'm going towards, I'm just trying to get a better angle for me to extend my folded leg to hit the bicep and then re-pummel this foot back to the bicep. So now we're going to look at the defense when we're fully stacked. So Lockie's got both the C grips and he's punched both of the toes to the mat. It can be quite hard for me to use that previous defense I showed because Lockie's got all his weight going through my feet. So it can be quite hard for me to move from here. So if I use two frames, either one or two frames, I can actually take some of the weight off of his hands and therefore some of the weight off of my feet. So as I start to frame, like so, now there's a little bit less weight and I can actually start to bring my feet across my body. You can use both hands, or you can use one hand framing the shoulder and the other hand guiding your foot to then recover, getting your hips back to the mat and then also bringing the feet back to a safer position.
All right. So Now we've got, let's look at the double ankle stack. And I just want to talk about, Ari's posture here. So his hips are lifted, his head's off the ground. He's got a posture that you take to prevent a through the legs or around the legs pass. But when I manage to get, as soon as he recognizes that I'm underneath the legs, so I reach behind the ankle and this ankle as well, my ability to stack then becomes high. He's going to put this head to the ground and drop his hips. Head and drops hips. Okay, so like you need to be very quick at that. Okay, that's really important. And then the other part of this is the leg dab. Okay, so we're going to watch him fold one leg, and as soon as he folds one leg, it's very difficult to complete this particular action. See, he folds that leg and chops it back, and it's just the angle of my hand. I don't know if you can see my left hand here, but I can't really push in this direction from where my hand ends up. This one I can. My top arm, the near arm, you see I've got good ability to push. Ari can't just chop through that here, but he could if it was folded. Okay, if it was folded down to here. So now with my other arm, look at my firearm down there, it's a weak action. It's like shoulder flexion compared to this being more like in line with my shoulder. My force is going through my shoulder. It's not such a large moment arm to fight. Okay, we'll see another example here. So look at that. Here you can probably see the angle. Look at my right arm being in great position to push. My left arm's in a terrible position to push. So if you took my right arm out of the equation, it was just my left arm here. There's no way I could push Ari's leg towards his head with my arm like down near my, essentially where my knee is. Okay, that's a very weak position. Okay, so just look at where it starts. I try to, see, I kind of try to drop underneath. I kind of lower my elbow and everything to try to get some force behind this ankle, but he's folded it well. Okay, again, it doesn't have to be, see here, I really drop behind it. Okay, but as he slides back, that becomes difficult, and I miss everything.